We, and we should all mute ourselves as the others are speaking and darken our screens, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's so nice to see you all on this cold January morning. I'm Deborah Miller, the JCRC's Director of Maryland Government and Community Relations. Before we begin, I want to let everybody know that this program is being recorded. I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to the third and final of our three-part Maryland legislative series, Legislatively Speaking. While, of course, we had hoped to gather in person this year at our annual wonderful legislative breakfast, we decided it was smarter to hold this event online once again. As many of you know, the JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the Maryland, Northern Virginia, and DC organized Jewish community, which is home to over 300,000 Jews. The agency represents more than 100 organizations, synagogues, and the Jewish Federation, in advocating not only for the needs and values of the Jewish community, but also for the well-being of everyone in the greater Washington region. Today, our Legislatively Speaking webinar focuses on our priorities at the federal level, and we are grateful to be joined by the Honorable Jamie Raskin, the Honorable John Sarbanes, and the Honorable David Trone. After our congressional members talk about issues that are critical to them and our community, our Executive Director, Ron Halber, will moderate a discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and he will try to get to as many as possible. Now it is truly my honor to introduce Congressman Jamie Raskin, who represents Maryland's 8th District. This is his third term serving on the House Judiciary, House Oversight and Reform, and House Administration Committees, as well as his second term on the Rules Committee and the Coronavirus Select Subcommittee. Representative Raskin was also renamed chair of the Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Prior to his time in Congress, Mr. Raskin was a 3-term state senator in Maryland, where he also served as the Senate Majority Whip. He earned a reputation for building coalitions in Annapolis to deliver a series of landmark legislative accomplishments, including marriage equality, abolition of the death penalty, and strong equal pay for equal work. Mr. Raskin has authored several books, including his hot off the press, poignant memoir, Unthinkable: Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. Please welcome Congressman Raskin.
Good morning, Deborah. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Wait, just tell me what I'm supposed to do right now. Should I address the priorities of JCRC, or?
We would love to hear you address issues that are important to you, what's meaningful to you, and also what is going on Capitol Hill, and issues that are, as you know, issues that are of tremendous concern to us.
Terrific.
So this is your free for all for about five.
This is my free for all. Okay. Well, thank you for that beautiful, lovely introduction. It's great to see you. It's great to see Ron. It's great to see Bobby Schulman. All of you guys, I feel like you're family, and I want to thank you and everybody in JCRC for all of the support and encouragement and sympathy and solidarity over the last very tough year. Look, we are still in the fight of our lives, I believe, to defend the basic institutions and values of American democracy. And we experienced a brutal assault on American constitutional democracy on January 6th, just over a year ago. And we need to be doing everything we can to fortify our democratic institutions at every level. And so that means fortifying physically the Congress, our windows and our doors, and improving our security, just like we want to fortify the not-for-profit sector, including religious institutions that have come under attack and abuse and vandalism and so on. We want to fortify centrally our political democracy and the voting rights of the people and the ability to transmit the popular will through the rickety and the obsolescent edifice of the Electoral College, but we need to do the best we can to defend the idea that the people choose the president. So I know my friend John Sarbanes may have a report for us. I think that he was down with the president yesterday in Georgia. I'd love to hear from him if he was down there about that. But we are all fighting hard to defend the voting rights of the people. There are hundreds of pieces of legislation around the country designed at repealing weekend voting, early voting, making it more difficult for people to vote by mail. In Georgia, they signed into law a piece of legislation which makes it a crime to pass a chocolate chip cookie or a bottle of water to somebody waiting in one of those endless lines to vote. So there's just a crazy crackdown going on against voting rights. And so we need to turn that around. I am on the January 6th Select Committee. We are going to be having hearings as early as February, maybe March, that will look a lot like the Watergate hearings. They will be 2 to 3 weeks of, I'm hoping, primetime hearings where we tell the entire story of the attack on American democracy and then make a host of recommendations about what needs to be done to fortify our institutions against further attack and further erosion. And I look forward to that. Everybody, I hope, is aware of generally what happened to us on January 6th, where there was a mass, wild demonstration called for by the then president, which turned into a riot, a mob riot. There was an inner ring in the middle of activity, which I call the insurrection ring, by the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Aryan Nations, the militia groups, the QAnon networks, the First Amendment Praetorian, Unification Church. All of these domestic violent extremist groups came together. They'd been training for battle, and they were the first ones to break our windows, knock down our doors, and attack our officers and lead the way for the general mob to descend on officers. And 150 of our Capitol officers, our Metropolitan Police Department officers in DC, over 60 Montgomery County police officers, some also from Virginia, were injured. Broken jaws, broken noses, broken necks, traumatic brain injuries, many of them walking around today with post-traumatic stress syndrome. And then finally, the inner core of all the activity was the realm of the coup, which I know is a strange word to use in American political parlance, but there was an attempt not to overthrow the president, but by the president to overthrow the vice president in Congress in the lawful transfer of power called for by the Electoral Count Act and the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. So we're going to tell the story of the whole thing, how these different levels of activity were coordinated, who paid for it all, and what we're going to need to do to prevent in the future. So that's what I've been working on, and I'll turn it back over to you, Deborah, and thank you so much for bringing us together and for all that you guys have done to keep our local democracy and community so strong through a very tough period.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin, for those remarks. I am Todd Rosenberg, and I serve as co-chair of JCRC's Maryland Commission. It's now my pleasure to introduce Congressman John Sarbanes. Congressman Sarbanes has represented Maryland's 3rd Congressional District in the House of Representatives since 2007. He currently sits on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and its Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change, and serves as the Vice Chair of the House Subcommittee on Health. Congressman Sarbanes also sits on the House Oversight and Reform Committee and its Subcommittee on Government Operations. Mr. Sarbanes is the chair of the Democracy Reform Task Force, which has assembled H.R. 1, the For the People Act, to reform and strengthen our democracy. He has led efforts in Congress to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, focusing on empowering residents to take an active role in restoring it. Born and raised in Baltimore, Congressman Sarbanes has experience working in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Welcome, Congressman Sarbanes. We look forward to your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Todd, and thank you to Ron and Deborah and the entire JCRC community. Let me begin just by thanking you for what you do every single day, assembling key concerns within the Jewish community, but the broader community as well, and then channeling them into really meaningful work that's done and has been done year in and year out, as well as, and this is an example of it, making sure that your elected representatives understand what the key priorities are that are important to you and your members and to the broader community. I know you have a tremendous impact in Annapolis in terms of bringing that perspective to bear, and obviously we in the federal delegation rely on your insight and advocacy as well. So thank you for that. I do want to take the opportunity just to lift up my two colleagues momentarily. You just heard from Jamie Raskin, who is one of the key leaders in Washington now when it comes to fortifying our democracy. We're all, it seems, on any given day working on different dimensions of that. But his inspired courage in so many ways, in so many capacities over the last year or so has really set an example for other members of Congress, including myself. So I want to thank him for his good work there. David Trone has become a national leader when it comes to addressing the issues of addiction, particularly focusing on the opioid crisis, issues of mental health, all things that we're now seeing accelerate in the midst of this difficult pandemic that we're all going through. And on that last note, let me thank the JCRC for helping the community navigate the challenges of COVID. We're on a roller coaster ride there, as we know, very disruptive to people and disorienting for families and the broader community. And anything that sort of functions as a banister that you can grab onto when you're feeling unsteady to help get through that is important. The JCRC is fulfilling that role, no question. Let me touch briefly on the president's speech yesterday, because I did have the opportunity to be in Atlanta and hear his forceful and Vice President Harris's forceful defense of our democracy and their clarion call that the United States Senate take up two very important bills, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that would shore up many of the weak places in our democracy at a time when we know that the threats are grave that are coming at us. My view is that last year, or in 2020, 150 million Americans reached out, pulled our fragile democracy back from the brink, but what they pulled back remains fragile. And we really need to invest in it to make sure that it's there for the ages. And that's a multidimensional effort, but it includes getting these key voting bills over the finish line. We're kind of at the end game with that. The president's speech, in a sense, launched a week in which Senator Schumer will be pushing forward on this, demanding a vote in the Senate. If there's still obstruction, sadly, that we've seen from the Republicans on the Senate side, then Senator Schumer is prepared to seek a rule change that would allow this important legislation to get passed and onto the president's desk. Doesn't mean we yet have every one of the Democratic votes in line, as you know, but it's a ongoing process, and this week will be extremely important. So that's where things stand on that front, and that's been a significant commitment of mine. I want to thank you for your priorities, frankly, because looking through them over the last day or so reminded me again of JCRC's broad kind of vision of what matters and impacts not just the Jewish community here in Montgomery County and Maryland and across the country, but the broader needs of our nation, particularly when it comes to the safety net. We can talk these days, I think, in terms of a need for not just a safety net, but a health net. And we have to work harder to improve and invest in the public health system in this country, so we're better prepared, frankly, for things coming at us like the pandemic that we've seen over the last 2 years. But having a safety net in place, making sure we're investing in our people, is what helps get them strengthened and fortified to withstand these difficult moments as they hit us. And in particular, I want to thank you for the attention to our elderly and making sure that we invest in the Medicaid program but also be innovative with the Medicaid program. I spent 18 years in private practice representing healthcare providers, and in fact had a niche practice with respect to older Americans. And we do need to find ways to lift up community-based home care for our elderly, which is a priority that JCRC continuously puts on the table. And I thank you for that. That advocacy is really, really important. There are significant investments that we've made in that, but in particular, if we could get the Build Back Better Act through, which we're working on right now, that would lift up that particular innovation. We talk about naturally occurring retirement communities where people are aging in place. If we can bring services to them in their homes, that can make a huge difference. I saw in my work as a lawyer, the importance of being able to move money with the person, which is another thing you support to help our elderly stay in their homes or frankly be moved out of an institutional setting. So thank you for that. Very, very much appreciated. You've also lifted up the child tax credit as an important priority. That's something we've been working on through the Build Back Better Act and making sure that the Older Americans Act is significantly funded and kept strong as we move forward. Obviously, moving to issues that affect the Jewish community directly, I'm sure we'll have some conversation about this in the Q&A, so I won't go on too long, but again, your perspective there is extremely valuable. Obviously, investments in the nonprofit security grant program, making sure we keep that strong, and frankly, plus it up if we can. I know you've sought to, in a sense, double the capacity of that program. I am very supportive. I know all of us on the call today are very supportive of that effort. And then the challenge of combating increased anti-Semitism across this country. We know it has in various insidious ways of rearing its ugly head. And all of the evidence coming back right now is that's on the rise. We also know, if you're enlightened, that that's the canary in the coal mine. When you see that happening, you understand that the other connective tissue of our society is beginning to fray in terms of extremist views taking hold. It's all connected to the broad discussion we've already had so far this morning. But we have to push back against that and push back forcefully and do it in a way that demonstrates the solidarity of the broad community, where all of the diversity of our nation is brought to bear, sort of linking arms to say this is unacceptable. And the JCRC has played a tremendous role in assembling that diverse coalition of solidarity in the face of these threats. And I thank you for that. We'll obviously continue to work closely with you to address that and other threats. I know we haven't touched on all the priorities because it's a pretty extensive list, but I appreciate very much the good work that you do. And with that, I'll yield back to you.
Thank you, Senator Congressman Sarbanes, excuse me. Good morning. My name is Bobby Shulman, and I'm co-chair of the Maryland Commission. It is my honor to welcome Congressman David Trone. Congressman Trone was elected in 2018 to serve Maryland's 6th Congressional District. He serves on the House Appropriations and Veterans Affairs Committees and the Joint Economic Committee, where he's fighting to make progress on issues including the opiate epidemic, criminal justice reform, mental health, and funding for medical research. While earning a master's in business administration, Mr. Trone opened his first store selling soda and beer. Eventually, excuse me, eventually that store grew into a business with more than 200 stores in 24 states and 7,000 employees nationwide, 650 of whom are in Montgomery County. It is this expertise in business and management that he brings to Capitol Hill. Welcome, Congressman Trone.
Good morning, everybody. Bobby, thank you for that introduction. And it's great to see Ron, Deborah, and the whole JCRC team. You guys have been awesome supporters and leaders in our community, and we really appreciate it very much. It's good to have today with us John and Jamie, the folks from Team Maryland in Montgomery County. And, their leadership has been so important. The work that John has done to lead the Democratic caucus on voting rights. I mean, he is the man that's leading the charge on this. And we're absolutely so thankful, because if we don't get this right, we're not going to have a Democratic majority, and we're going to have a Democratic Party. And we can't thank Jamie enough for his tremendous ongoing leadership. Thank God we have Jamie in place for this moment in time. He's perfectly positioned. His background as a constitutional scholar is leading the impeachment proceedings against President Trump, and then leading on January 6th, the fight back about what happened and expose Insurrection Day. The work Jamie is doing is just so vitally important to our nation. And if we don't expose it, we're going to have a hard time, very difficult time digging ourselves back out. So I can't thank Jamie and John enough. We've also had a tough year. All of us have last year, with 800,000 deaths in COVID. And with that, we see a cure at some point with the vaccinations. We still get the breakthrough cases. But when I talk to my hospital CEOs, it's still 80 to 85% of the folks that are in hospitals are the unvaccinated. Less than 2% have actually had the booster shot, and that less than 2% are the least sick of all. So it's clearly so important that we get the booster, get all the vaccines, but our country's paid a horrible price. But lost in that is the 100,000 folks that died in the last 12 months to drug overdoses. We've almost forgotten about it. So I've continued to try and work in the midst of this gloom and doom to work on addiction, work on medical research, because we've seen how important the medical research is with the RNA and the vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer. And so I've been trying to lead through the Appropriations Committee a focus on NIH and medical research across our country. And if we can get this new bill passed, we'll move over $10 billion additional dollars, almost a 20% increase to NIH, to medical research, which can make such an unbelievable difference. And we really need your help to continue to inform us what's happening in the community. So the partnership with the JCRC is so important. But in the area of addiction, we've got to break the stigma. If we don't break that, we can't talk about it and surface it. But it's more than 100,000. It's not a number. These are mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, co-workers, our children that have been lost. And we've all know people ourselves have suffered through it. As you know, I've lost a nephew at the age of 24. And all through Congress now, folks are realizing people in their communities, and this is becoming and will become a key issue as soon as COVID begins to recede. I'm working hard to deliver a report, which we'll deliver early in February. I'm co-chairman on a bicameral, bipartisan commission as appointed by Speaker Pelosi on the Commission to Combating Synthetic Opioid Trafficking. I led a delegation to Mexico of 16 folks to meet with the Mexican intelligence community. We went to the border to meet with our border community, our intelligence community there, to really understand how fentanyl, which is the killer now, that's replaced the Oxycontins and replaced the heroin, it is all now the fentanyl that's coming from precursors in China, being made in Mexico by the cartels. The two major cartels are behind this, and what we can do to stop the supply, but also what we need to do to stop the demand, because the supply is going to be a very difficult mountain to scale, given the lack of resources the Mexican government has, and unfortunately, I hate to say it, but the lack of willpower. And the lack of willpower in Mexico is simply there for survival. They simply want to survive, to see their families tomorrow, because that cannot and probably will not happen if they take on the drug cartels directly, as much as we might like it. They're not willing to do it. So in addition to co-chairing that commission, which our work is coming to a close, it's been going on for almost 2 years now. I'm also co-chairing the Bipartisan Addiction and Mental Health Task Force. I know that's important to everyone here on the call today. We've got over 70 bills now, and those are moving through Congress, most through John's Energy and Commerce Committee. And we've already have 2 bills in these areas of mental health and addiction that have been passed and signed into law by President Biden. But from our seat in the Appropriations Committee, we're helping to drive the funding, into these 2 areas. But clearly, the connectivity between addiction, connectivity with mental health, these are the issues that will be survive COVID and will not have a vaccine to cure them. It's going to only take hard work and hundreds of different efforts to work and help our country through these 2 areas. But right now, our children are really suffering from the mental health crisis. And it's imperative we address this issue between what's happened in schools and remote learning and the focus on technology. Our country is going through a severe mental health crisis that is the newest epidemic. And finally, in the area of Jewish community issues, I know these issues are very important to me as a father of 4 Jewish children. And the appalling anti-Semitism, both in the media and in our neighborhoods, continues. We're all committed, John and I and Jamie, to stand up, do the right thing, recognize Israel as not just a crucial ally, but the most powerful force for good in the Middle East. And as leaders, we need to continue to foster peace and build positive relationships throughout the Middle East. I'm glad to announce just this week, we formed, and I'm co-chair of a newly formed bipartisan, bicameral group called the Abraham Accords Caucus, taking steps toward building on the Abraham Accords with our Abraham Accords nation, putting together connectivity with Israel. And we're looking forward to continuing with that caucus to promote tolerance and freedom in the Middle East. We have a lot of work to do. And like John and Jamie, we're looking forward to the question and answer. And it's always great to be before some of our most informed, if not our most informed constituents on such a broad panoply of issues. So thank you for having us here today. And I look forward to Q&A.
Thank you, Congressman Trone. I'm very much appreciative of your leadership and of your remarks. And thank you, Congressman Raskin and Congressman Sarbanes. What I'd like to do now is to throw out some questions at you and then give each, and I'm going to start each question by addressing it to one member of Congress and then giving the other 2 of you a chance to opine on it. And this way, hopefully, we will get through a whole bunch of issues in our limited time. First, I'd like to start with Congressman Raskin. Congressman Raskin, having just completed your book and having heard your remarks this morning, what can you please explain to everybody why the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act are so important to pass, in your opinion, for the preservation of our democracy in the future? You're muted, by the way.
Thanks so much, Ron. Look, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act repairs the damage that was inflicted by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County versus Holder case, which basically gutted the Voting Rights Act by targeting the pre-clearance requirement and specifically the coverage formula for it. So it's a kind of technical assault on the Voting Rights Act that really began to strip away its effectiveness. And of course, the Voting Rights Act of '65 was the single most important voting rights protection statute of the entire century in the last century. And it's been essentially neutered in this century because of that decision. So this is an attempt by us to repair it. There's no guarantee, by the way, that the Supreme Court, in its current hostility to voting rights, will accept the changes we're making. But this is a necessary effort by us to replenish the Voting Rights Act. In terms of the legislation that's still alive, I mean, what we had under John's leadership was the For the People Act on the House side. That's been whittled down considerably in the legislation in the Senate, which we'll have to be satisfied with. And I hope that both bodies will pass it this week. But the focus there is to protect weekend voting, to protect early voting, to protect people's access to the ballot, and to undo all of these efforts to strip people from the polls, to purge to purge people from the voting rolls and so on. And that's the basic thrust of what's in the legislation now. I mean, it is literally the heart of democracy. I mean, without voting rights, we don't have a real democracy. And we didn't have real democracy until the Reconstruction Amendments and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. We were a slave republic. And then we fought that battle, but then, things backslid for a long time. And then the modern civil rights movement came forward with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And those have been pulled apart in different ways. So, I mean, this just goes to the question of what kind of democracy we're going to be. I am of the opinion that even with all of these assaults, we are still the world's greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious constitutional democracy. But we also know that that's completely up for grabs now, because there are people who want to take us in a completely different direction by attacking the right to vote and undermining our elections, subverting the elections, replacing bipartisan electoral commissions, the kinds that we've always had in Maryland, with partisan electoral commissions, or even putting them directly under the control of the state legislatures. So really dangerous tendencies developing in different parts of the country. So we know democracy's been under attack all over the world, and our democracy's been under attack by foreign authoritarian governments. And so, all of them today, the dictators and the despots and the bullies and the tyrants, are rooting for the collapse of American democracy. Putin in Russia, and Orban in Hungary, and Duterte in the Philippines, and al-Sisi in Egypt, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, all of them are betting on the failure of American democracy. And meantime, the strength of our democratic allies around the world, like Israel, the strength, the democratic movements around the world, like those in Russia or in the Middle East, the strength of human rights around the world depends on a strong America. So FDR used to call our party the democracy. You can go back and read his speeches. He would say, the royalists say you invest in the wealthiest people in the society, and some of the wealth will drip down to everybody else. But the democracy says you invest in the working majority, and everybody will rise together. Everyone will get wealthy together. Well, never has it been more appropriate in our lifetime to call our party, and I know it sounds partisan, forgive me, but to call our party the democracy, because we are the ones standing up for democratic institutions, values, and everybody's right to vote.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Sarbanes, would you like to add anything to that?
Only that the Freedom to Vote Act, which is the second piece of legislation and is sort of the Senate side reformulation of the For the People Act, which we introduced on the House side, is really at root designed to make sure that the forces that seek to diminish the voice of the people out in the country are not winning the day, and that similarly we push back against forces that tend to diminish the voice of the people in Washington. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're seeing a stampede of voter suppression across the country, laws that are being passed in dozens of states that would roll back basic access to the ballot box. And the Freedom to Vote Act, through a whole series of provisions relating to how people get registered, how they cast their vote, whether that's early, by mail, in person, on election day, et cetera, is trying to lift up that access and make sure that people's voices can be heard. And then when it comes to how we operate in Washington, you have to push back particularly against the influence of dark money, this hidden money that is really the hidden hand of how the policy-making apparatus functions in Washington and has undue influence in a way that sometimes overwhelms what the broad public would like to see. And so we've got to make sure that those provisions are in place, and those are included within the bill. So it's a broad attempt to make sure that people's voices are respected in our democracy. And I would say as well, because I think now, sadly, too often in terms of where are there safe spaces in our society, but the polling place should be a safe space. People should approach their interaction with the electoral system with a sense of confidence. When you get up, you know, on the morning of the day you've decided to cast your vote, whether you're going to do that at a early voting site or on election day or by sitting at your kitchen table and filling out an oval on a mail-in ballot, you should feel confident that you can do that without fear of running into obstacles or having interference run at you and so forth, and that your vote will be counted. That's all we're trying to preserve here. And you would think that we'd have universal consensus politically among elected officials for those kinds of basic protections. Sadly, that's not the case. That's why we have to move when the opportunity is presenting as it is now to make sure we get that infrastructure back in place. And that's what we're working really by the hour right now to try to achieve.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Trone, would you like to add anything about democracy preservation that the two congressmen before you have addressed?
I think they did a phenomenal job. This is John's issue. John owns it. John's been the leader on it. We can't thank John enough. I mean, Shelby County set the stage for our problems. And I think the Freedom to Vote Act, now often referred to as the Manchin Bill, if we can get one particular individual to feel good about his own importance, maybe that individual will feel good about the importance of voting rights. And maybe we can get something done in the damn Senate and move forward. But it's pretty frustrating that we can't get something as straightforward and as right as this. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Congressman Sarbanes. You started discussing aspects of the child tax credit, which we know happens to be one of the most effective anti-poverty tools for children. What are its prospects, and what are the prospects of the Building Back Better Act passing, or do you think Congress will take it up in pieces? So if you can talk a little bit about the BBB and a little about child tax credits and its prospects for passage, and I'll come back to the other members for their comment.
I appreciate that. I'll be pretty quick. The Build Back Better Act, a lot of the components of that actually came through the Energy and Commerce Committee that I sit on, where we have jurisdiction over health issues, for example, and other related issues. And the child care tax credit, as you say, is an incredible tool in fighting childhood poverty across the country. In fact, in the year in which it was in effect, and that recently concluded, obviously, the estimates were that it reduced childhood poverty by 50%. I mean, that's transformational in terms of the impact on families that are struggling across the country and the communities in which they live. So there's very much a commitment on the part of the Democrats who've been pushing hard on the BBB front to make sure that whatever that package looks like, ultimately, that it includes some meaningful extension of the child tax credit. And that's all been subject to negotiation. As you know, it started with a fairly extensive continuation of the child tax credit. And then in the back and forth, it was being proposed as a one-year extension. We're still fighting very hard because we appreciate the huge positive impact that can have. And frankly, that assessment I just gave you with respect to child tax credit can apply to many of the things that are contained within the Build Back Better Act, which is really designed to fortify people's ability to get through their day. You know, most families, when they get up, you know, they've got a sort of basic set of transactions to manage over the course of their day. If we can support them, whether it's investing in the services that help older Americans, or investing in the next generation in terms of the child tax credit, or funding community college or investing in education and so forth. And then making sure working people have got the benefits that they need in order to sustain their families and their communities. That's what it's all about. That's why we're so committed to it. The exact path forward on that is not entirely clear, but the commitment we have to get it done, and certainly President Biden remains very strong on that. He was talking about that yesterday. I think we're going to get something meaningful done. What the vehicle for it will be, we'll see. There's a number of ways we can do that, but the commitment is there. And I thank you all for the support you've given to so many of the key components of that legislation.
Congressman Trone, would you like to comment on the Build Back Better Act and the child tax credit?
I think John nailed the child tax credit. It's the crucial piece of legislation that really, as you said, cut child poverty in half. But it's a $200 billion price tag. There seems to be serious pushback from Mr. Manchin, unfortunately. But on top of that, there's so many other good things in Build Back Better. And I mean, what I like to talk about a lot also is the $400 billion, almost twice as much money in that toward childcare and preschool universal. That we can focus on education and get all of our folks, young children, white, black, and brown, on the education pipeline, we all get off on an equal start where the parents have childcare. It doesn't break their budget, doesn't break the bank, and then they can get preschool. That $400 billion will pay dividends forever. And then, of course, the $555 billion that we have in the appropriations for clean energy and climate change. I mean, this is the most important long-term effort in our country. If we don't think long-term, and that's the problem with Congress, it's all about today, and it ought to be about tomorrow. And that's what education is for our kids. And that's what clean energy and climate change is. And then, of course, $130 billion to get more folks on the ACA so everybody can have insurance. This is a right in America to have insurance. So this legislation is crucial. We've got to get all we can over the finish line. And it seems to be a tough lift right now because of two individuals. And I know we all support eliminating the filibuster.
Congressman Raskin, would you like to add anything about the Build Back Better Act and the child tax credit effort? You're on mute, sir.
Real briefly, we're very proud of the infrastructure legislation that we did, a $1 trillion plus investment in the roads and the highways and the ports and the airports and cybersecurity and universal broadband, which is important to so many of our constituents, and on and on. That's like the physical infrastructure of the country, but we need to make the same investment in the social infrastructure of the country, which is what Build Back Better is all about, as well as the democratic infrastructure of the country, which is why we're fighting so hard on the voting rights front. As David rightly points out, there's a crisis in childhood in America today. The Surgeon General declared a crisis of mental and emotional health among young people. And it's just been a very, very tough time for young people. Obviously, that's something my family's been focused on, but it's not just ours. It's young people everywhere who are angst-ridden about the future, about climate change, about COVID-19, which has been profoundly isolating and demoralizing to people. And then when you get to childhood, if you compound all those things with poverty, it's just a recipe for disaster. So we need the child care tax credit, which has been remarkably effective at cutting child poverty in half. And we need the investment in universal pre-K for every 3 and 4-year-old in America. I mean, this remains the wealthiest society on earth at the wealthiest moment we've ever had. We can invest in early childhood education and the development of kids when they need our help the most. And we're going to save on a lot of problems later on if we do that.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Trone, a question for you. You spent a lot of time discussing mental health and talking about that, opioid addiction. There was clearly a crisis of mental health even among young people, even before the pandemic started, as Congressman Raskin does, and now it's only been accelerated by kids being in isolation with virtual learning, angst about the future. My question is, if there's a couple things that you could magically improve or fund overnight that would make a tremendous difference in the mental health picture for our nation and our young people in particular, what would you do? Or what can be done?
I think the two biggest things that you need to do is, obviously we talk over and over about stigma, and it's amazing. It's all the different groups in our country, the various racial groups have tremendous problem with stigma also. I have an advisory group of African Americans. I have a Latino advisory group. I have an Asian Pacific Islander advisory group. And I have a Muslim group. And all of those groups I've spoken with and met with, and we talked about mental health. And every one of them to the T talked about how their society, it's just them, they thought, but it's all of us, that they weren't willing to talk about it and surface it and say, I need some help. I need some help. If we can't open the dialogue and take away that stigma, we can't really help the people because they're not letting us in. And we're going to see the suicide numbers that we have in the US. And that's been clear. And we also have to work on research. The second piece is medical research has been so focused from the neck down. And we've got to change that. I mean, everything that matters is from the neck up. And so we've got to drive dollars to NIH and Francis Collins and his successor to drive into research. And, that's absolutely the two key things I'd work on: stigma and research. That's the most important things. And of course, equivalency on how we pay our doctors. We're severely understaffed, especially in rural America, but everywhere, on psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists. We're grossly understaffed across the country because these are tough jobs that take a lot of mental out of you when you execute that job. And the pay isn't near as good as a doctor that can work 4 days a week as an anesthesiologist and then play golf. These are tough jobs and they're not paid properly. So we have a bunch of legislation in all of these areas that we're pursuing. But thanks for talking about mental health, Ron.
Congressman Raskin, on the topic of mental health.
Well, on paper, theoretically, we have a right under our insurance regime to mental health coverage as well as physical health coverage, but it's a promise that's honored in the breach mostly, and there are large parts of the country that just don't have the mental and emotional health resources they need. So that needs to be a major commitment and a massive investment to take it seriously. If we're running one of the authoritarian societies or dictatorship, the mental health of the population, like the health of the population generally, is not that important because all you really care about is the people at the top. But if we're going to have a real democracy, we need everybody to be thriving and everybody to feel good. But we got tens of millions of people who have been experiencing sharpened symptoms of depression, anxiety, and other mental and emotional illnesses during this period. So we're going to have to make that investment to make the resources really available to people. There's a project I like very much that's run out of the UK called the Spirit Level, where they focus on sharp inequalities in society as the source of a lot of mental and emotional suffering across the board. And so everything that JCRC is fighting for, like in your priorities for investment in the safety net, are the kinds of things that will improve mental and emotional health and well-being generally in the society. We've got to make sure everybody's seen and everybody's needs are being met.
Let me take this opportunity to plug the Jewish Social Service Agency and the Jewish Family Service Agencies in Baltimore and in our community, which literally take on thousands of people. I know in our community that our Jewish Social Service Agency accepts any insurance, accepts Medicaid, accepts any form of reimbursement, and we do a lot of private philanthropic fundraising to fund the gap between the actual fee. And that I can tell you from, this being one of my areas of interest, that the amount of money that insurance companies reimburse for a session is absolutely ridiculous. You can a therapy session today can cost $150 to $200 in private practice. You only have a small panel of people to pick from, and sometimes you can only get $40 or $50 per session back reimbursed, which is very, very hard for a low-income family which truly needs that assistance. Congressman Sarbanes, a comment on mental health?
Well, I don't know that there's too much to add to the good comments you just heard, but the basic question is, where are the sources of major stress coming? And can we do something about it? And, Jamie just mentioned that the economic inequality and economic challenge is obviously a huge source of stress on individuals, on families. I mean, President Biden talks all the time about how a job is dignity for a person, for their ability to provide for their family, to contribute to their community. If you don't feel like you have the economic standing to get up every single morning and go out with confidence into the world, that creates a huge stress in your life. When we look at climate change, it's creating huge stress, particularly on the next generation, which is sensitized to it in ways that I think older generations really can't appreciate or understand as well. But that is a huge stressor. We look at the shaky democracy and our concerns about that. I mean, that's political climate change, really. And in the same way, physical climate change is producing these intense storms, which are impacting communities. Political climate change produces violent storms as well. That's what happened on January 6th, that we just marked the anniversary of. So can we do something about these things? I mean, the last source of stress is knowing in our hearts that we can address these things and then not doing it, and feeling deflated and powerless as a result of that. We can do this. We can invest in an economy that lifts up families, makes it easier for them to get through their day. We can address the threat of climate change if we focus on it and sustain that focus. And we can absolutely, Americans should lead the way on this, restore democracy and push back against autocracy that we're seeing growing around the world, and lead here in this nation with that. So we can address these things. And then if we address them, then we've addressed that broader source of anxiety, which is the sense of powerlessness. And you can add so many things in there: gun violence, all these things, addressing all of the challenges. So that's what we do to repair our society and ourselves and the world. And we need those investments, and we need the kind of advocacy that you bring to bear every single day to make sure that we are going to pursue those investments.
Thank you, sir. And just one final question. We'll do a round robin very quickly. A lot of people in the Jewish community are concerned about anti-Semitism, BDS, and about the growing number of congressmen, particularly on the Democratic side, who want to put restrictions on the type of weapons that Israel receives. Obviously, the JCRC is strongly opposed to anti-Semitism, strongly opposed to BDS, and strongly opposed to putting any weapons restrictions on the military aid that Israel receives from the United States. And I'd like to know what you, as a Democratic member of Congress, can do to help us combat against these types of issues. Again, anti-Semitism, BDS, and weapon restrictions. We'll start with Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Thank you, Ron. I'm gonna have to excuse myself right after this one because I've got a meeting that's starting.
The last question.
Okay. Look, anti-Semitism and racism are the gateway to destruction of our democracy. And, it all started in this recent period back in Charlottesville in August of 2017. And then that turned into January 6, 2021. It was just supercharged, and the people who gathered 500 strong back then gathered now in a group of 40 or 50,000 with domestic violent extremists as the stormtrooper vanguard of the group that led the attack on our democracy. So it is essential for us to engage in all of the kinds of things that that you guys are doing. I was with Deborah Lipstadt at the White House, who's been held up as our new envoy against anti-Semitism for totally phony political reasons, and it's just wrong. And so we got to shake that loose, because anti-Semitism is a global threat to us now. I'm with you on BDS. I spoke out very strongly against some efforts at the University of Maryland to get the student government and the university behind BDS. My daughter was a student there at the time. I went with her to speak against that, and it's just the wrong way to go. We're living in a time when what we need is mutual dialogue, participation by everybody on behalf of democratic values. Jewish Americans, Arab Americans, people working together, not trying to isolate and polarize things. And as for the various weapons programs, especially Iron Dome, I've been very strongly supportive of that, because Israel's got to have its basic strategic security against a lot of military threats in the Middle East. I do hope that there will be a military de-escalation all over the world, so we can be investing the money we need in climate change and all of the domestic programs that we're talking about, because militarism, as Eisenhower said, ultimately is a theft from our ability to feed people and educate people and so on. But Israel is obviously in a dangerous neighborhood and absolutely needs Iron Dome and these other weapon systems. So the restrictions that I believe that go in weapon sales are standard, that they've got to be used for the purposes allotted for Israel and for other countries. So I don't know that there's need for any new restrictions. I don't know which ones you were referring to, Ron, but I've not seen anything about that, and I don't know what they would be. So you can you can count me with the program for the security assistance funding for Israel.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin. Congressman Sarbanes, anti-Semitism, BDS, weapon restrictions.
Yeah, well, my answers would pretty much mimic what Jamie just said. Obviously, we need to be very focused on maintaining Israel's security and our commitment as a Congress on a bipartisan basis to the Iron Dome system, as well as to the memorandum of understanding, the 10-year memorandum of understanding, which brings important security assistance to Israel, is steadfast. I think it's going to remain steadfast, and our delegation is very committed to that. On the BDS, in its most dangerous forms, it represents a hard edge coming against Israel in what might be argued by some as its innocent forms. I view it as very naive, frankly, and that's why I think we've got to be vigilant about that. And those of us on this call have been very strong in positioning against the threat that the PDS movement presents to Israel over the last few years and into the future. I do want to take the opportunity, just speaking broadly about anti-Semitism and our need to combat it on an ongoing basis, to thank the JCRC for your continuing to urge us and advocate for Holocaust education programs, something that the three of us obviously support very strongly in terms of investing with dollars from the federal level. And I want to thank you for reminding us to stay focused on the legacy concern of Holocaust survivors and the Holocaust Survivors Assistance Program. I think maybe a third of those still surviving, 80,000 across the country, live in poverty. We don't just owe it to them and to their families and to the memory that they are protecting. We owe it to ourselves and to the broader community to make sure we lift up their stories and their experience in a meaningful way. That's at the root of some of the most powerful and impactful education experiences that anybody can have, whether they're Jewish or not. So thank you for that advocacy.
Congressman Trone, would you like to address anti-Semitism, BDS, and restrictions on weapon sales to Israel?
Yes, Ron, thank you again for having us here today. And just quickly, I know we're over time, is that we got to follow up what John said on the Holocaust survivors. I mean, that memory, we can never let that slip away, or we're not going to be successful and never again. But on BDS and anti-Semitism, putting them together, it's speaking up immediately by all of us when it happens, and speaking up loudly and calling it out for just what it is with clarity. And if we don't speak up, we're not going to be successful, and it will seep into society. On the weapons sales, on the MOU, sitting on the appropriations committee is, where I want to be and where I need to be. And those that are trying to put restrictions and limits, they are naive, they are unsophisticated, and we will not allow that to happen. And the hard left wing of our party, unfortunately, doesn't understand and appreciate the complexities and the danger and the innate goodness of what Israel does with their enemies, not to mention, all over the world. I mean, Israel just does so much, and no one sees it and gives them credit for it. So thanks for having us here today, and let's continue to stand together.
Congressman Trone, let me also thank you for your leadership on the Abrahamic Accords, which, of course, many of us in the pro-Israel community would like to see the circle of friendship with Israel and with its Arab and Muslim neighbors extended, because we believe in the end that security will make it easier for Israel and the Palestinians to make peace the more that Israel is integrated into the region. So I wanted to thank Congressman Sarbanes, Congressman Raskin, Congressman Trone for their leadership, for giving us an hour of their time today. I think we are extremely proud in Montgomery County to have you all as our representatives. We have an esteemed group that we look up to, and we're very lucky to have you there representing us in Congress. And thank you for your time today and for your friendship and warmth with the Jewish community. And thank you to Debbie Miller and to Bobby and Todd for helping to organize this call and putting us together. This is the final of our legislative series. We look forward to seeing you, everybody, in a few weeks as we continue our webinars and other topics and issues of concern. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, sir.
All the best. Thanks.
Thank you.